Good evening from Bangkok, and we're delighted to welcome you to this webinar on promoting the social reintegration of women after release that's been jointly organized by the Thailand Institute of Justice and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. My name is Pratna Rao. I work with the Thailand Institute of Justice, and I'll be your moderator today. As some of you probably know, that this webinar today is the third and final webinar in a series that UNODC and TIJ have been hosting over the past month, with a focus on gender-responsive criminal justice and prison reform. The first two webinars covered gender-responsive non-custodial measures, highlighting UNODC and TIJ's recently published toolkit on gender-responsive non-custodial measures, as well as good practices, challenges, and country-specific examples on implementing alternatives to imprisonment in the context of COVID-19 and beyond. With this final webinar of the series, we wanted to focus on ways of promoting the social rehabilitation and reintegration of women after release from prison, exploring the existing landscape of what's available in different countries. Especially now, with governments in many countries releasing women and children, if they aren't provided with proper pre- and post-release support, reintegration back into society can be particularly challenging for some women. So we want to use this platform today to discuss the short and long-term needs of women being released from prison, using very practical examples from different countries. Before I introduce our fantastic panel today, I have a few housekeeping instructions. So this webinar is available in English and Thai. For those of you who want to listen to it in Thai, please click on the interpretation button and then select Japanese. Zoom doesn't provide Thai language as an option, so if you select Japanese, you will be able to listen to the webinar in Thai. We will also be recording this webinar, and the link to the recording, as well as all PowerPoint slides and the summary of this webinar, will be made available on TIJ and UNODC's social media pages. Everyone's microphones have been muted, but you will see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to use the box to ask questions to the panelists. The panelists will either type their answers or they will be answered at the end during the Q&A session. If multiple people want the same question to be answered, please click on the like button that you see next to the question. We will try and answer the questions with the greatest number of likes. Don't forget to use the hashtag Bangkok Rules in practice on Twitter to engage with the discussion. With that, I'd like to hand over the floor to our first panelist. So our first panelist for today is Ms. Muriel Juda Etpigno. Muriel is Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Officer at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Muriel, you have extensive experience working with the criminal justice system. To begin with, can you tell us why we need to consider specific social reintegration programs for women, as well as any examples of existing programs available globally? So the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Pratana. And before just starting this presentation, let me, on behalf of UNODC, thank the Thailand Institute of Justice, with whom we've been doing this great cooperation, not only for the webinars, but more broadly with this fantastic project that we do in a southeastern part of Asia. So, of course, as you mentioned, there's a lot of things to be said. And first, I would like to briefly explain to you why we need social reintegration and why we need a specific program for women. And then I will, in practice, give you some example of UNODC support in this specific field. So I let you please start with the PowerPoint so that I can start preparing. So let's move to the very first slide. I would like to briefly, because I don't want to spend too much time on that, to really recall that the social reintegration is included in many different instruments, including legally binding instruments, as well as United Nations standards and norms in crime prevention and criminal justice. And it's clearly mentioned as a means of preventing further crime and protecting society. So I've put on the slide just to recall you brief overview of those principles. And starting with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that states that the essential principle of the treatment of prisoners shall be the reformation and social rehabilitation, as it's mentioned in its Article 10. Then in the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the treatment of prisoners that we now call the Nelson Mandela Rule, which as many of you know, very important and recent set of standards in this field, it clearly establishes that the provision of meaningful rehabilitation programs in prison is crucial to achieving the ultimate purpose of a sentence of imprisonment, which is to reduce recidivism and to improve public safety. You can find in the Nelson Mandela Rules more dedicated space and focus on what kind of prison-based rehabilitation programs are needed to achieve this goal. For example, education, vocational training, work, treatment, different type of treatment depending on the individual needs. And of course, what brings us today is also what happens to women, because then the community realized that we needed a dedicated instrument for women offenders and prisoners. So in 2010, the General Assembly adopted the United Nations rules for the treatment of prisoners and non-custodial measures. So it was adapted to give guidance to policymakers, legislators, sentencing authorities, and prison staff on how to reduce the unnecessary imprisonment of women and to meet the specific needs of women who are imprisoned. So we can see that this fundamental principle is really encompassed in those international instruments. But now we know also that there's studies and evidence that showed that is absolutely relevant to achieve this goal. We have some studies from different countries showing that prisoners that receive education, vocational training, any kind of really rehabilitation activities are less likely to return to prison after release. So this is really crucial to see that not only we have this principle, but also practice and studies that shows that it is efficient to reduce recidivism. So let's move to the second slide. So the question now is briefly, how do we foster the social reintegration of prisoners? Social reintegration of prisoners is sometimes understood as the support given to offenders during their re-entry into society following imprisonment. But in fact, there's a broader definition that encompasses a number of interventions that could be undertaken at different stages of the criminal justice process. So it's really important to mention that we can already start as of whenever the person is in touch with the criminal justice system. For example, following an arrest, we can divert offenders away from the criminal justice system, giving them alternative measures, including restorative justice, suitable treatment, community-based sanctions, rather than imprisonment, which could be the best way to foster the social reintegration process. Then later, the second stage would be within the prison setting. So for those who are sentenced to imprisonment, this includes, as I mentioned, prison-based rehabilitation programs. It's extremely important to know your prison population and to do some individual assessment to define the type of program that would be needed for them, to give them really the best skills to be ready to then reintegrate into society. As mentioned before, medical, psychological treatment, counseling, education, vocational training, work, all that kind of program can help fostering their reintegration. Last but not least, we are talking about post-release intervention that can also begin at the time when the person is in prison. So that's also very important. And we know that when people leave the prison, they face additional challenges like finding accommodation, finding employment. And indeed, finding employment is one of the most challenges for them to face. So let's move to the next slide, and to go more into details, you can easily access our tools that we have on our website, the Handbook on Prevention of Recidivism, the Prison-Based Rehabilitation Program Roadmap, and also the last very interesting publication is the Toolkit on Gender Responsive Non-Custodial Measures that has been also done with the Thailand Institute of Justice. So just for you to know that we have more additional information and tools for you accessible if you want in the website. So let's move to the third slide maybe. So now the question, now that we know that we need social reintegration and rehabilitation program for the overall community, both for offenders and prisoners. So why do we need specific program for women? So actually, if you look at the data, this is very interesting. We know that both male and female prisoners will face barriers, obstacle to a successful rehabilitation and social reintegration process. Could be institutional, could be individual. We know that there's a lack of political will sometimes, lack of resources, so it's very difficult to access those programs. However, it's very important to know that female prisoners have additional barriers compared to male prisoners. And compared with the number of male prisoners, the number of female prisoners is relatively small. And despite significant regional differences and a 50% rise since the year 2000, female prisoners currently constitute approximately 7% of the world prison population. And as a result, most prison systems and programs tend to be planned, designed, and managed for male prisoners, who are the major population. So, and usually women are not really taken into account and specific programs not implemented. It's very important to understand why we need those specific programs, to know what is the specific profile of women prisoners. In fact, most female prisoners at the global level have been convicted for non-violent offenses. Their offenses are often related to substance abuse or economic pressure, need to economically support children or other family members. So this is a kind of common trend. We also know that most women who are admitted to prison are mothers, and many have primary care responsibility of other family members. And those responsibilities and relationships can play a very important role in the woman's pathway to prison, but also in their rehabilitation prospects. So this needs to be taken into account. Women in prison are more likely to have a history of sexual and physical abuse. They also suffer a lot from mental illness at a higher rate than male prisoners. And whenever they have a history of drug abuse, it tends to be different from that of male prisoners. So we can very easily see that it's a different type of prison population with different pathway and profile and different needs that needs to be taken into account. What is essential, like for any person, would be to have an individualized assessment of each woman to define what kind of treatment and program would be needed for her. So let me now go to the next slide so I would like to mention some overall good practices. And in particular, I would like to mention one specific program that UNODC has been supporting, because I think it's a good example of how we can change and address concretely this issue. So we already mentioned that most reintegration programs have been designed for the main prison population, meaning male prisoners. And however, we know that some countries are trying their best to have a different approach. And we know that the Bangkok rules reiterate, how this is needed to do. So I would like to mention just very quickly that there's a lot of different things that can be done, from home leave, open prison, halfway house, different type of community-based intervention that could be done for women to adapt and to fit their specific needs. In Bolivia, let me just briefly explain this project before I end up this presentation. We have tried to start, and you can go to the next slide, to train female prisoners in the construction sector because it's a major growing sector in the country. So we really want to give them the real skills to find a real job employment upon release. So this is a key issue. Also because this type of work will bring them a better salary than any other type of regular or female activity that usually they do. This is very important also to train them to give them, opportunity to be economically empowered. But also, we also link them. We link them with the post-release support, which is actually an NGO working in the construction sector, a dedicated association for women who will help them in concretely, upon release, go to the right place and find the right job. So this is already, as you can see, trying to find a mix between a very interesting training for them to find opportunity upon release, and also linking those women to a professional association which would help them upon release. So I just wanted to highlight by this example that I think this is a very interesting combination, not only because we break gender stereotypes also in giving them different skills that what you usually see, but also we really think about while in prison, but also what we want to achieve is to give them employment and opportunities to have a second chance in life. So I just wanted to highlight this event as I think a good example of what we can be doing. And there are many different opportunities, and you will see by the next presentation that other countries have great, example that I hope could be also replicated in other countries. So for this, I leave it for this now, and happy to also answer the question later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Muriel. I think you perfectly highlighted that reintegration interventions don't need to start after prison. It always starts at the first touch point when women enter the criminal justice system. And another really important point that you highlighted is that we need to do research to understand who the women in our prison systems are before we can actually address their needs. And with that, that's a perfect introduction to our next speaker, Rob Allen. Rob is an independent researcher and UNODC consultant. And Rob, last year, I know that you undertook a small study on the challenges that women face in Southeast Asian countries during the re-socialization process post-release. Can you tell us a little bit about that study and what you found?
Yes, thank you very much, Pratana, and thank you very much for the invitation to say a little bit about this study that I did last year. Could you put the first slide up, please? And this was a study that was funded by UNODC and the Thai Institute of Justice. Next slide, please. Just a word about the methodology. So I was able to visit Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand in the spring of last year. We held an expert meeting in Bangkok in September. I produced a report, and hopefully we're going to do some follow-up work probably next year now. Obviously, this work was done prior to the COVID-19 crisis, so I'm not sure what has happened in the Southeast Asia region in relation to early release, but I do know a little bit about what's been going on in the UK, so I thought I'd just show one slide about the response of the prison system, the justice system to women in the UK. Next slide, please. There were quite a lot of plans to make early release more widely available for women, particularly pregnant women, and it has happened, but it has happened to a much lesser extent than many people hoped, and instead the government has decided to build some new prison accommodation. This is actually single rooms for women in a women's prison in the north of England, which are kind of prefabricated models. I show this one really just to illustrate why it has proved so difficult to do special early release for women, and that is because of problems of accommodation, safe accommodation for women, homelessness, and so on. And sadly, one of the consequences or results of a kind of lockdown situation in the community has been that levels of domestic abuse of women has increased, and there is obviously a concern on the part of the authorities to ensure that women and children are safe, and this is one of the big challenges. Like so many, the COVID crisis has emphasized some of the pre-existing problems that face many vulnerable people in society. Next slide, please. Back to the Southeast Asia situation that I looked at last year. Prison is used more for women in this part of the world than globally. So more than 10% of prisoners in Laos, Myanmar, Singapore, and Thailand are made 10%, more than 10% of women. As Muriel said, it's 7% globally. Drug-related offending is account for more than 4 out of 5 women prisoners in Thailand, more than half in Cambodia and Singapore. We're talking here about a variety of drug offences and drugs, but often methamphetamine is involved. And also foreign nationals make up a significant proportion of prisoners, particularly in some countries. Now, next slide, please. All of these and other factors have implications for post-release services. These charts on the right, the orange, this is to do with the kind of drug offences, and the top one in Thailand, the bottom one in Indonesia. The orange chunk is sale and possession. I'm sorry, the orange one is sale and possession for sale. The blue one is use. So the point of showing this is that, as Muriel said, many women are involved in this because they want to raise, or they need to raise, an income. Some of them, many of them as well, will have addiction problems. So the challenge both for rehabilitation in prison and for resocialization afterwards is to try and provide an alternative pathway which enables women both to get clean, get off drugs if they have dependence problems, but also to find some realistic alternative. And that needs to take account of family relationships. Sometimes those family relationships can be helpful, sometimes they can be a hindrance because they may be involved. There's a small but significant proportion of women in prison in these countries whose husbands or boyfriends are also in prison, and they have been involved in drug offending as a kind of family enterprise. So this has got to be a comprehensive approach. And I think it's fair to say many of the stakeholders told me the risks of reoffending are actually quite high for many of the women. As far as foreign nationals are concerned, although there are some agreements between countries, the transfer of foreign national prisoners takes place relatively infrequently. There are lots of other factors that relate to the challenge of resocialization, how long women are in prison, their health status. Sometimes if they're part of a minority ethnic group, they won't necessarily be able to access the same services as the majority population. And the kind of post-release support will sometimes be voluntary if someone has come to the end of their sentence, and sometimes it will have some compulsory elements if it's part of a system of parole, for example, that was introduced in Malaysia about 15 years ago. Next one, please. One of the factors maintaining family ties, I mentioned that there are some difficulties sometimes, but we heard about some really interesting work in Cambodia from the NGO This Life, which encourages through financial support and transport families to stay in touch with their daughters in prison, and also to combat the stigma that can sometimes attach to the imprisonment of women. Often I heard more so than for men, and this can act as a disincentive for families to continue to help sometimes their daughters who are in prison. In Singapore, which has a very well developed system of reintegration planning, the strengths of family support is an important aspect of that. In Malaysia, parole officers visit an offender's family prior to release to make it as part of the assessment. Although the system is not particularly geared to women, it's a gender-blind approach. But there are some difficulties with the family side of things in Indonesia, and we may hear about this more later. The law requires families to report relatives who use drugs to the authorities. So this can act as a hindrance. And some women, I was told, find it hard if they have been living in a city. The idea of going back to live with their family, perhaps in the countryside, they may go for a while, but they get bored, and soon they drift back to the city. So this whole issue of maintaining family ties is complicated and requires careful assessment. Next one, please. Lots of very good work inside prisons, psychological treatment, counselling, vocational training, training women to work in call centres and actually paying them a proper wage while in prison, and then offering them the opportunity to work in a call centre outside the prison was something we saw. Family reconciliation services. This picture on the left is a rather strange one, you might think, but this is a cafe in a town very near a prison, Pattaya in Thailand, where women and men work. They're transported from the prison each day. They learn to run this cafe in the town, serving coffee and pastries, very good too. And in that prison, I thought an excellent initiative where the prison director invites women and men, in fact, but there were a lot of women and their families a few months before they are due to be released. He invites them to tell him in a public forum what are their plans for when they are released. What are they going to do? Where are they going to live? How are they going to earn money? The reason he wants to use the last few months in prison to try and equip those women with what they might need to succeed, whether it is earning a bit more money in prison so they've got something to go out with, or particular problems that they might need to be addressed. And in Thailand, there is a very, I think, excellent scheme of giving grants to prisoners who come up with plans to invest in some sort of small business, to buy equipment or whatever it might be. And in this particular prison, interestingly, of the 20 grants, I think, that were given last year, almost all were given to women prisoners, which suggests to me that they were seen as a rather better bet in terms of being able to put the grant to the use that was intended. Next one, please. Next slide. So the question of accommodation, no, sorry, one back. The question of accommodation, Muriel mentioned halfway houses, and there are good examples of halfway house accommodation in many Southeast Asian countries. Malaysia has some, but in Malaysia, one of the stakeholders I spoke to told me this: some women do not want to go there as they've had enough of following rules. The shelters have curfews, they expect residents to do cleaning and other chores, they therefore choose to stay with friends. And I think, as with a lot of these things, particularly the more voluntary ones, we need to try and find ways to make these offers attractive to people coming out of prison who often have had enough of being told what to do. And so I think it's a great skill to be able to develop that. And of course, NGOs have a great role in doing that. We heard about one in Thailand, the House of Blessings, a religious one. That one looks after the children of mothers in prison who then can rejoin them on release. And I know that's a controversial question, because whether young children of mothers who are imprisoned are better off in institutions or should be, wherever possible, placed in with other members of the family is I know quite a divisive topic. I mentioned the grants and other help with self-employment that's also offered. So finally, just to say, the report that we produced had a number of recommendations. I've just chosen 4. It's got to be comprehensive. What I mean by that is it's got to try and address all the issues that women face when they leave prison. It can often be offering quite a big package to enable women to change their lifestyle. Careful assessment, as Muriel said, about ensuring that if women are going to return to their families, either their parents or husbands or partners or whatever it might be, to check that that really is the best option or whether it might cause problems. This question of ensuring that these services are provided in a way that is most likely to sustain commitment from the women and are not too too much just like an extension of prison. And finally, probably a need, and this is not just in this region, I think it's throughout my career in every part of the world I've had the opportunity to visit, it's the case, there is a need for better organisation of post-release services for both men and women, but particularly in this context for women, and having a rather better system of funding and coordination, both at the level of nation states, but also at the local level where all of the work actually needs to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rob. I think you've done a perfect overview of this report that captures, there's so much information, but you've condensed it in this time perfectly. And I think one really important thing that you've highlighted is the importance of family as a key player in the rehabilitative pathways of women. And you mentioned a couple of examples from Thailand, and I'd just like to talk about how Thailand 10 years ago in the Southeast Asian region has spearheaded the adoption of the United Nations rules for the treatment of women prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders, which is also called the Bangkok rules. So in many ways, Thailand plays a really important role in this region in providing research as well as capacity building and policy advocacy for women prisoners. And with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Chontet Chunura is the director of the Office for the Bangkok Rules and Treatment of Offenders at TIJ. Chontet, can you tell us a little bit about the efforts in Thailand to support the reintegration of women prisoners?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Pratana, for the introduction. And as Pratana mentioned, that Thailand Institute of Justice, or TIJ, we have been one of the organizations that try to promote the implementations of the Bangkok rules in Thailand and the Southeast Asian region and at the international level. So we are really delighted to jointly organize this webinar series with UNODC. And for my presentation today, you can put up my slides, please. For my presentation today, what I'm trying to capture in this 10 minutes is the efforts in Thailand where we try to promote gender responsive rehabilitation and social reintegration through what we call a social partnership model where we engage the communities and various stakeholders to take their part. So as the research and practices show, and I think previous speaker also mentioned that women have different needs and gender specific needs really need to be taken into consideration when we design and implement rehabilitation and reintegration program. So for us at the TIJ, we try to promote the use of women experience as the foundation for rehabilitation and post-release support. And I think women experience in these three settings are significantly important. So we're talking about women experience as their pathway coming to prison. We know that women have different factors and circumstances that limit their life choices and shape their pathway into prison. Several researchers highlight poverty, substance use, victimization, addiction, and caretaking responsibility, and so on. We also need to look at women experience during imprisonment and difficulty that they face. We know that several women have limited to opportunity to rehabilitation programs, and that is due to the prison overcrowding or overclassification, and that's including a gender-neutral program that was implemented in most prisons around the world. We also know that after women are released from prison, they'll face several obstacles in re-entering back to society. Research have shown that gender-based stigmatization, the difficulty in finding employment, family breakdown, a low self-esteem, and so on, has put the women in a really difficult place for their reintegration. So these are the three main women experience that we should and really emphasize in designing rehabilitation and reintegration program. But beyond that, during the COVID-19 situation, we have seen that several factors that has made the situation of women in prison worsen. For example, we know that to combat the spread of COVID-19, several prison has very little choice but to suspend all in-prison visits and programmings. And from our focus group, as part of TIJ research, I had a focus group with some prison staff. We know that by cutting off visit has placed a really significant mental distress and anxiety that women cannot keep in contact with the family and their loved one. And because of the suspensions of visitor from outside, and that could lead to suspensions of some vocational or education or training program that was before was heavily rely on external parties. So we see the implications of the COVID-19 on the rehabilitation and reintegration of women. We know that some women might be released during that time. Can you go back? Please, yes. Some of the women were released with a really limited knowledge and support during the COVID-19. And on their way to returning home, the traveling during the COVID-19, where in Thailand, right, a few weeks ago, we have the national curfew implemented. So returning home during the curfew time can be a difficult challenges and an immediate challenge as women leave the prison. So this is why we see the coordination between prison and local authorities and civil society are extremely important to ensure that women can safely return to their home. Next slide, please. And for Thailand, as of now, we have a prison populations of nearly 380,000 people. And among this number, 12.6% are women. And regarding the recidivism rate of people who were released in 2016, we know that 14.5%, 26%, and 34% will return to prison within 1, 2, and 3 years, respectively. With the profile of women, the vast majority, which is 83% of women, are in prison because of drug-related offense, followed by a property crime and life and bodily harm, which is a very small percentage, 1.4%. And the majority of women in Thai prison are incarcerated for 2 to 5 years, aged between around 34. And 2/3 did not complete their high school, and the majority of them are mother. So this is the profile of the women that we are working. And during the past few years, we have seen a lot of positive efforts that are trying to promote successful rehabilitations and also the pre-release program. Rob has mentioned a lot of this program in his presentation, and I will not repeat. And another thing which is happening in the recent year is this establishing of the Center for Assistance to Reintegration and Employment by the Department of Corrections of Thailand. So this is a care center aimed to help women fighting employment, also men, fighting employment after release. So we have also seen the increasing number of social enterprises and business that directly provide a support to prisoners in terms of hiring them or to provide training for them. So this is a great phenomenon that we have seen in the past few years. And this year, one positive move is the cabinet has agreed in principle to give a tax incentive for company that employ former prisoner. And we've seen this is a very critical and crucial movement that could encourage companies and private sector to take their part and to encourage them to give employment opportunity to those who released from prison. And the last part is the social partnership model, which is one of the efforts that Thailand Institute of Justice trying to promote. And because we know that with the overcrowding problem in Thailand, and most of the pre-release and rehabilitation programs in the country are extremely under-resourced. So what we are trying to do is to encourage the several stakeholders from different sectors to take their part and be part of the initiative. So we start this pre-release program at the Ayutthaya prison. We work with 34 women who are about to be released, work with them for 3 months. And we were able to engage with 9 different groups, including, for example, SME Trade Association, the NGO partner, the private recruitment company, social enterprise who work on financial and debt management. We also work with a lot of civil society and community leaders. So everyone will bring in their skills and under the key theme that we design, which involve mental empowerment, income management, career and business planning, and family relation. So these are the key areas that we work with the prison authority and highlight that what we could do to provide an extra support. For example, the prison already teach prisoner how to cook or how to do a bakery, so that is practical skill. So what this group, our program trying to support is to provide that extra support on how to make a business planning, how to find a loan, how to do a marketing properly. So we see this sort of collaboration between prison and community outside that try to support women along the way until they are released. And during this project, so we work with the women's 3 months prior to their release, and also provide a post-release support for 1 year through our NGO partner. So, so the whole project is not in any way try to compete with what the government is trying to do, but I think the bottom line is that this project is trying to get the ownership or engagement from the communities, and especially private sector and business sector, which are very rarely get involved into this reintegration and rehabilitation process. So, and next slide, please. And I think in conclusion, what we have learned through this process is that the process allows the several stakeholders to initiate and, to listen to what women's prisoner needs, to listen to their story, to understand their pathway into prison, and more than anything is reduce the wall or they break the wall between people on the inside and people on the outside. So we try to create this sort of collaboration, and we hope to continue this kind of project and work closely with also the departments of correction. So this project that I'm telling you about is just one initiative from the TIJ, and we engage with several parties in Thailand. But there are obviously several great initiative out there. So in 2019, Thailand Institute of Justice, together with Penal Reform International, what we're trying to do is to outline all this what we've seen as promising practices in terms of rehabilitation and social reintegration for women's prisoners. We collect good practices in terms of education, work, and vocational training program, and conclude with the 10 key principles for gender-sensitive rehabilitation program. So all the details outlined in this publication, so feel free to download it or visit TIJ website for more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what you've highlighted perfectly is that we cannot work in silos in the criminal justice system, and it is really important to partner with people outside the system and cross-fertilize across sectors for the maximum amount of impact so that we can help the largest population of women. A very important player in this is the government. So I'd like to now invite our next speaker, Aisha Yuliani, who is Criminal Justice Program Coordinator at UNODC Indonesia. Aisha, we know that you work quite a bit directly with the Indonesian government. Can you give us an overview of the available post-release programs for women offenders?
Sure. Thank you, Pratana. So before I started going into the government scheme on both preparation for reintegration and after release service, I would like to tell you about UNODC's work with the government of Indonesia on this topic. Before this year, our work tends to focus on improving rehabilitation and reintegration services for inmates that are still within the corrections facilities. In Indonesia, unfortunately, they currently do not have a specific guideline or guidance that differentiates the service provided for female inmates. However, there has been initiative after lobbying and conversations between UNODC and the government of Indonesia to start developing that guideline. We will start having the conversations starting this year, which will continue, and we hope that the final guideline would be developed next year. We also assist the Ministry of Social Affairs in developing a policy paper on the development of transitional housing, or they would like to call it shelter or information center, for inmates who have been released from prison who either does not have a place to live at, or they have a place to stay but does not have access to employment center. They don't have access to renew their IDs and other services that I would be explaining in my presentation. So that's in the pipeline on this topic between UNODC and the government of Indonesia. But before I go further into the services provided, if we could have my slide up, please. On slide number 2. I would like to give a brief overview of the correctional system in Indonesia. If you see in the table, I had 2 different dates for the data. One is 30 March and the other one is 23rd of June. 30 March is the number of inmates that were in the correction system before the government of Indonesia starts releasing inmates to prevent, mitigate the risk of the spread of COVID-19 in the correctional facilities. We do not have a gender breakdown of the number of people released, but what we do know is that 40,026 inmates, both adults and juveniles, were released between 30 March to 23rd of June, with 39,043 of them are adult inmates. There are 33 women's prisons across Indonesia. So each facility are placed in the capital of the provinces. There are 90 parole and probation offices, and only 5% of the prison population are women. However, this number has steadily increased since the 2000. We only had 3.4% population of women in correctional facilities back in the 2000, but now we have 5%. Similar to most countries in Southeast Asia, most of these women are incarcerated for drug-related crimes, particularly for distribution or possession with intents for sales. The second crime is actually drug users. So the top 3 are drug-related crimes for distribution and possession with intents for sales. The second one are just drug use or possession with a small number of possessions. And the third one is just general crime. Next slide, please. So the pre-release program and support I have to highlight here is the advancement in implementation of Bangkok rules in correctional facilities in Indonesia cannot be separated from the support that TIJ has provided for the government of Indonesia. We have seen a very large advancement in the types of services provided in correctional facilities. We have psychological support, healthcare, narcotics addiction rehabilitation program, vocational training, and prison work program. The reason why I put an asterisk next to the psychological support is that not all of the correctional facilities actually have a psychologist or a therapist as a staff, but they often try to fulfill this need by partnering with universities. So usually graduate students or faculty members who could come once a week to provide the psychological support, or they would link up with a hospital who could provide this type of support. The unique one for women's correctional facility in Indonesia is that the provision of homework with mom program. So a lot of the times the family visit hours in the correctional facilities run from 9 o'clock to noon, and then it continues from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m., which means that if these women have children who are still of school age, they could not join their family members to visit their mothers. And there's no visitation on the weekends. So with a lot of this women's correctional facility, they started providing afternoon session once a week, specifically for children to visit their mothers. And they call it homework with mom because they really encourage the children to bring their actual schoolwork and for the mothers to be involved still with providing guidance and working on the schoolwork with their children to make sure that there's still this ties connection between the mother and the children, and also to increase the involvement of these women in the child rearing. However, as Chantit has mentioned in her presentation, with the COVID-19 mitigation program, all of this pre-release program actually has been canceled because no one could come in and out of the facilities other than the officers. So the Family Links program has been replaced with a video call system. They either use a webcam like Zoom, because the government of Indonesia actually has a Zoom service, and a WhatsApp video call. So some of the officers actually has chipped in and bought phone numbers for the WhatsApp video call to call their family members. It doesn't make it easier because it does create difficulties and challenges, especially for inmates whose family does not have phones. So we're hoping that with the government of Indonesia reopening the country and starting to slowly reopen the correctional facilities, that this could slowly return in a safe manner. Next slide, please. Now, I would like to focus on after-release provider. In Indonesia, there are two types of after-release. One is provided directly by the Directorate General of Corrections through the Parole and Probation Office. These are for inmates who are released on parole, on temporary home leave, or for reintegration leave. And the other one is provided by the Ministry of Social Affairs through the city or provincial social services. This service is intended for inmates who have completely served their sentence. The interesting point about this service provided by the Ministry of Social Affairs is that while the central government has their own program, the city or provincial level usually have their own initiatives, because a lot of the times the services are funded mostly by the city, which would be interesting because it might differ from the qualification and the standards given by the Ministry of Social Affairs on who could receive these services. Next slide, please. For the Ministry of Social Affairs, the client criteria is actually quite strict. They have to be men and women older than 18 years old. So for juveniles, so for girls, they actually could access the services, but it's different because they're provided from a different section in the Ministry of Social Affairs. So there's a specific section on juveniles, but I wouldn't go into that for now. So for adult ex-inmates, they have to be men and women older than 18 years old. They have concluded and been released from correctional facilities after serving the length of their sentence. They have to be unaccepted and or marginalized by their family and society. They have found difficulty getting a gainful and or permanent job, and plays a role as the head of the household slash breadwinner of the household, but could not fulfill its roles and functions due to his or her status as ex-inmate. So as you can see, these are quite strict criteria for all of these ex-inmates to access the services. The part on playing a role as head of the household or breadwinner of the household is actually not that difficult to fulfill, because a lot of these women, as has mentioned by the previous presenters, came from impoverished background, or they were a single parent, or they live in a dual income household, but the spouse's income could not fulfill the need of the household, or a lot of the times they still have to support their parents. So there's a sandwich generation issue also. But the issue is on the part on unaccepted or marginalized by their family and society and finding difficulty getting a gainful or permanent job. Because a lot of the times these women actually could get a permanent job. Usually it's part-time, but it's not the kind of job that is actually gainful. And there is not currently, the Ministry of Social Affairs does not have specific indicators to point out what actually could be considered as a gainful job, what is actually unaccepted and marginalized by their family. If you could still go home, but your neighbors does not accept you, are you in the category of unaccepted and marginalized by your family, or are you considered as accepted by your family, hence you're not eligible for the program? But as I mentioned, the interesting part is that because there's an exception at city provincial level, a lot of the times the city social affairs office would still provide services for this woman through public-private partnership, through NGOs that would provide vocational training, employment opportunities. And actually also a lot of the times the city and provincial level social affairs office provides service for inmates who are released on parole with the parole and probation office. So there is a program supported by the social affairs for DGC. I know that my time is up, so I think I would explain more if there's any more questions on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuli. I share. I think you mentioned perfectly that the program is so robust that you can't cover it in the 10-minute time slot, but I'm sure you'll be happy to answer questions on this later. And you've given us a lot of examples of practical steps that can be taken to support women. So thank you for that. With this, I'd like to introduce our final speaker. Julie Mariama Sisse is Programs Manager of Advocate Sierra Leone. Julie, can you tell me a little bit about Advocate's work as well as support services that Advocate provides for women pre and post-release? The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation and thanks also for the introduction. Promoting social integration of women after release from detention is one of Advocate's core mandates. Advocate has been operating in Sierra Leone since 2006. Advocate work with women and girls caught up in all stages of Sierra Leone's often unjust criminal justice system. We are the only organization in Sierra Leone that offers holistic access to justice for women in contact with the law. Advocate has built a firm reputation as a successful campaign and service delivery organization. Over the years, Advocate has developed innovative legal education and empowerment programs, acknowledging that rights cannot be enforced unless there is knowledge of those rights. Through our advocacy work, we have increased visibility and attention to the needs of women in prison, both in Sierra Leone and regionally. Next slide. Advocate strengthens access to legal advice, legal representation, legal education for girls and women in Sierra Leone. We provide creative legal education and training to ensure women know their rights. For example, our TV and radio drama series, Police Case, reach over 1 million people, educating them on rights when they come in conflict with the law or they are in contact with the law. We also ensure that girls, women, and their children in detention are treated in accordance with the minimum standard set by the United Nations. Advocate also assists women in detention and provides post-prison support through our Go Before, meaning in our local dialect Creole, Moving Forward program. which educates, empowers, and reintegrates former detainees, ensuring that they return to their communities stronger women with a brighter prospect. Next slide. In our post-prison support, we go through different stages. We have the pre-release stage. Before a woman is released, we get in touch with a family member to inform about the upcoming release and develop an individual post-release plan. If they get released on bail, we include respective bail conditions in the plan. Also, advocate ensures each woman has a place to go to after release and a small transport grant for the journey. For post-release, we conduct exit interviews. Advocate social workers conduct interviews to assess the needs and collect information on their experiences in the criminal justice system. It also gives startup grants. Advocates provide newly released women with startup grants, which can be spent on setting up a small business or meeting other immediate needs. For post-prison support, Advocate has this group that has been formed called Go Before, that it's a support group for newly released women that are encouraged to join the self-organized group of women supporting each other and themselves through jewelry making, selling, and other small enterprises, learning how to make rugs. They will sell all of these things out. For the first few post-release months, advocate social workers follow up with formerly incarcerated women through monthly meetings. Next slide. Let me just talk you through some of our case studies. We have some case studies how we have been engaging women who were released from prison. Kadi was arrested for child trafficking. She was detained at the Waterloo police station for 10 days, where she met an advocate paralegal who assigned her case to a duty counsel. On her first appearance in court, she was remanded at the Freetown Female Correctional Center, where she spent 5 years of her life on pre-trial before appearing in court for fair trial. While in incarceration, she experienced psychosocial breakdown and threatened to commit suicide. Her depression was also due to the fact that she left her 7-year-old daughter all by herself with no secondary caregiver, since she was unexpectedly arrested at her residence. To manage Kadi's mental status, our social worker conducted a series of psychosocial empowerment sessions through the use of focus group discussions, some behavioral schemes, and a family tracing of her daughter was also done, and she was referred to Don Bosco Interim Care Center for Girls. In March 2020, Kadi's case was acquitted and discharged for lack of evidence. Next slide. To deter her from reoffending upon release, Kadi was provided with psychosocial counseling, post-prison transportation, and a needs assessment was done through our client exit interview. She was also encouraged to register to the Go Before Women's Group. Kadi was provided with a post-prison business startup grant to start a small-scale food business selling cooked food around them. This small business has helped her earn income to upkeep herself and her daughter. To further assist her in reintegrating into society, Advocate plans to employ her as one of our office assistants in Freetown. But this was forestalled due to COVID-19. pandemic till after the restrictions are lifted. Kadi is now living happily with her daughter and hoping for a brighter and better future. This is just one of our case studies. Another case study that shows you how Advocate operates our post-prison system to assist these women to socially reintegrate into society is the case of Adama and Aminata's story. Adama and Aminata were detained at the Freetown Female Correctional Center for fraudulent conversion for 6 months. They had been duped by a man in America who told them he could help them to go to America and stole money on his behalf. With representation from Advocate Duty Council, they were granted bail with the condition to repay the full amount back to the complainant through a 1-year payment plan. Upon release, Advocate supported the women to set up small businesses and develop a plan to meet the payment plan's conditions and repay the complainants. So far, each month they have been able to make some payments to the complainants while earning income for themselves. They laid out what they were able to accomplish with the first grant and presented their progress report for the payments plan in court, which confirmed that they had made considerable progress. After several months, they turned to Advocate requesting a follow-up grant because of some unexpected personal challenges. In a meeting with Advocate social worker, the post-prison support plan was amended and a follow-up grant granted. Next slide. Advocate during this COVID time has been calling on the government. We have made series of press releases for vulnerable detainees to be released. Advocate has engaged the government of Sierra Leone concerning the spread of COVID-19 in prisons. In the past month, we have published 3 press releases calling for the release of vulnerable, pre-trial and child detainees in Sierra Leone to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in detention facilities. Partially responding to the call of Advocate and other civil society organizations, the government released 235 detainees, including 4 women, as part of the annual presidential pardon on 27 April 2020, Sierra Leone's Independence Day. The pardoned detainees are yet to be released. Their release has been delayed due to the COVID-19 and an attempted prison break that left several prisoners and 1 officer dead. Advocate continues to advocate for the government to release detainees and reduce prison overcrowding. Additionally, Advocate conducts mediation between complainants and those accused. We support and encourage alternative dispute resolutions at police stations for minor offenses to resolve cases and reduce prison overcrowding. We have many of short case studies, but I would just want to.
I think we've lost Julie. Unfortunately, she is in a location right now that doesn't have stable internet connection, but I would like to highlight her point that these case studies remind us that these women are real women with real stories. Sometimes it's easy to think about these women as just statistics in the criminal justice system, but by sharing these stories with us, she's reminded us how important it is to look at persons deprived of liberty first as women. And thank you also, Julie, for highlighting the pre and post-release interventions that Advocate is currently doing for women. With that, I'd like to move on to the Q&A session. A lot of you have been asking questions, which we really appreciate, and thank you for engaging with us. The first question that I would like to pose to the panelists is from Olivia Rope. She asks, do any of the speakers know of specific programs or adapted programs that are supporting women who are being released during the COVID-19 pandemic, or any input on what needs such women would have? Would anyone like to answer? Yes, Shantit first.
Thank you, Prat, and thank you, Olivia, for a good question. I think I can talk from experience of Thailand that during the COVID-19, a lot of programs were affected by not having external party entering the prison. So what we have seen that the program which can still survive during the COVID-19, including work programs such as the call center that just Rob mentioned, they are still be able to maintain and operate as usual. Programs which were heavily affected by the COVID-19, for example, the vocational training or a work program involving a handicraft or a factory program, which are probably not have the market or were affected by the economic difficulty at this point. So we've seen that the prison trying to adapting this vocational training from, for example, a sewing factory which used to truly make clothes or uniform, turning to making a face mask, and again, that could generate some income for the women by adapting to the situation. We have also seen some of the initiative regarding a temporary home for the women who leave prison at night or cannot go home during the curfew were in place. So this what they call little home was set up at the Central Women's Prison in Bangkok, allowing women to spend one night before they can safely return to their home. This initiative which has happened during the COVID-19 because they know that try to work with other agencies to make sure that women do not enter into the homelessness situation. And finally, we have seen some changes in terms of pre-release program and including the one that TIJ working on as well. Instead of having organize a physical an offline workshop, now we turn into an e-course or using other electronic material, bringing in this kind of knowledge that needed for women, including inserting content about the COVID-19 and the sort of job which can still survive even this COVID-19 crisis. And I think this situation has encourage the prison authority to rethink their vocational training. The traditional skill that they teach women might not be able to so useful or relevant. So that is also a part of the discussion in the country too.
Thank you, Chantit. I think Aisha, you had something to say?
Yes, so for the program in Indonesia, actually the Ministry of Law and Human Rights collaborate with the Ministry of Social Affairs to ensure that the women or all the inmates actually who are released due to early release scheme for COVID-19 are included in the social safety net program by the Ministry of Social Affairs. So they receive not only money, but also some main needs such as rice, vegetables, and all the different necessary needs to survive in this time, because a lot of the places are closed and work are impossible to get at the moment. So the first step that the government of Indonesia wants to ensure is that these women don't go home and have nothing to do and ended up in a life of crime. The second one is actually in a couple of cities and provinces, the private partners who work with both Ministry of Social Affairs and the Parole and Probation Office has actually opened their door for the women who couldn't travel home, because there was a lot of travel restriction a couple of months back before the country reopened, which means the women couldn't actually travel home to their family. So a lot of the private partners has opened their door for these inmates to stay there. And some of the work has transitioned into home-based work. So the vocational training provided are quite impossible because these women could no longer gather at the training center and or the Parole and Probation Office. So now they've transitioned into sending the instruction actually via WhatsApp and sending the equipment and items to the woman's home so they could start doing their work from their home.
Thank you, Aisha. I think with that, we can move on to our next question. The most upvoted question we have is, drugs have been a common thread in this discussion, with many women in prison having a history of drug use or being incarcerated for minor drug offenses. Where do drug policy reform, harm reduction, and decriminalization fit in this debate as interventions that would support reintegration while at the same time reducing incarceration? Would any of our panelists like to answer that? Yes, Rob.
Yeah, well, this is like we say in English, this is the elephant in the room, really, particularly in the certain regions of the world, but even in many countries, the question of how drugs are regulated, whether through the criminal law or through administrative law or in a non-criminal way, through a health approach. This is perhaps one of the major challenges facing the criminal justice reform throughout the world. So it is difficult in the work mostly that we are talking about in this seminar. We are taking the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. There are examples, I think, of countries that are moving in this direction of not using criminal punishment as a way to deal with drugs, but rather adopting a health approach. And the evidence seems to suggest that this has not necessarily led to a huge increase in the amount of drug taking among people. This is one of the fears that some people have about adopting a more liberal, or if that is the right word, not using the criminal law. Some people think we need it to prevent young people using drugs, but actually a combination of healthcare and education approach seems to do rather better than strict criminalization. So that is one side of it. The other side, of course, is to do with people who do become dependent on or addicted to drugs, how best to deal with them and help them to try to become clean, get away from this. And again, there is a kind of big question. Some countries have a rather strict use of abstinence programs, like the kind of 12-step program. So they are, and these are ones I have seen in this research in Southeast Asia, therapeutic communities which within prisons, which kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, this kind of approach. On the one hand, there are other countries which adopt more of a harm reduction, minimization approach, where they may use a range of substitution therapies and this kind of thing. My sense is that the world is moving towards a more of a health-based approach to this problem, but it is a slow and uneven journey. But of course, you are very right to raise it, because we would not have these problems of social reintegration, or not so many of these problems, and we would not have them in the way we have them if the drug question was dealt with differently.
Thank you, Rob. Would anyone else like to answer this, or should I move on to the next? Oh, Muriel, yes, sure.
Okay, I think it works. Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, just to add on what Rob has said already. I mean, we can see that in many countries, in many regions, actually, if we look at the global picture, imprisonment for drug-related offenses, which includes trafficking or dependency, is a key issue. So that's obvious. I mean, what is Rob mentioning about laws depends on the political will of different governments. And sometimes we've seen governments getting into decriminalization and then new tendencies going to the hard way, let's say, and be imposing more sentences. So obviously the consequences of this policy, you will see it in prison. I mean, the more you criminalize, the more people would be in prison for those offenses, that's for sure. But that's a political, let's say, issue, but it's something that's very interesting to debate. What is absolutely sure is that what we need to do is, what do we do with this prison population that is linked to the drug situation? So I think what is really important is to recall that among the principles that we are promoting, and UNODC has a lot of different specific programs in prisons targeting health and in particular drug-related issues. So what is important is to recall that we should offer the same treatment that is available in the community to the people inside the prison. So one of the main issue. The second point that I would like to raise, it's also very important to ensure a continuity of care. So whether you started in prison and then you continue it after release. So I think it has to be taken in its globally, let's say. So just wanted to recall those principles and also to mention that we have a lot of different programs in prison targeting this issue specifically related to drugs. Thank you.
Thank you, Muriel. We have time for one final question, and that is from Stephen Pitts, who says that the contribution of community-based volunteers to rehabilitation and community reintegration is increasingly recognized around the world as valuable. Would speakers be able to comment in particular in relation to women and women-centered practices, how the contribution of community volunteers might be increased? Would any of the speakers like to comment on that? Chonthit, yes.
Okay, so I think I agree that the idea of the community-based volunteer is one of the significant ones. And I think not only is bring the sense of community involvement in the reintegration, but it's also re-emphasize that the reintegration cannot be done by one party. It's not just about the work of the departments of corrections. So I think in Thailand and several projects, what we're trying to do is just to bring in the community leader, and some of them were already volunteers, probation volunteer as well, to come and listen and to be during the pre-release process, having these volunteers come and understand the women's, and also not to understand their problem, but also to give them, empower women who will soon return back to the community where they come from. So I think that the role of their, usually in Thailand, it's like the community leaders who also are the volunteers. So I think that's kind of give that sense of security and a sense of, acceptance for the women. And it's really important to create this mental empowerment for women who will soon return back to society.
Thank you, Chonthit. Would anyone else like to add to that? Muriel, yes. Muriel, we can't hear you. I think you forgot to unmute yourself.
Sorry. I think it's done now, right? Yeah, sorry, just wanted to say that we've seen that generally speaking, there's a lot of support in general. So I think any kind of support would be very much welcome. And I think community-based intervention in general are really good for the social reintegration and community volunteers. And sometimes we also see volunteers going to the prison itself. I mean, not only, supporting women after release, but also already coming to the prison, which is also a good thing, I think. Linking to the community is essential for the social reintegration in general. And we see that there's a lack of programs, a lack of support in general. So I think just want to reiterate how much, space, there's room for everyone. There's a lot of space there. And I think there's a lot to be done. And we still have to support any kind of initiative in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Muriel. And with that, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but we're really happy to see the kind of engagement in the Q&A box. And Even though we don't right now have the time to answer all these questions, we encourage you to continue the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Bangkok Rules in practice. As we end this webinar series, we want to thank all of you for attending our events, and we also appreciate all our panelists in this webinar as well as the previous two. Over the past month with this series, we have heard from experts in Thailand, Indonesia, Sierra Leone, Argentina, the US, Austria, and Georgia, who have given us insights into how the system can be more rehabilitative and just for women in conflict with the law in the short as well as long term. And we really hope that you found these webinars useful. So on behalf of the Thailand Institute of Justice and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, I'd like to say thank you again. And we continue to be committed to collaborate and support the cause of reforming the criminal justice system to make it more gender responsive. Thank you and good night.